Putin is furious, and this time it's not just about the front lines. Something just happened behind the scenes that's about to change everything. A new surge of US involvement has blindsided the Kremlin, and it's not just military aid, it's something deeper, more permanent, and far more dangerous to Russia's long-term strategy. At the center of it all, a Ukrainian initiative that barely made the headlines, one that's suddenly been supercharged, with quiet backing from the US. The full story is only now starting to emerge, and what's happening behind closed doors might not end the war, but it could reshape how it's fought from here on out. So what exactly set Putin off, and why are Western analysts calling this move a turning point? Let's dig in. Ukraine's Meza Media broke the story on May 7th, revealing that an investigation into Ukraine's official website for its Manufacturing Freedom Initiative, or MFI, showed a substantial investment from the US. Think of the MFI as a fundraising campaign. It's a mechanism through which Ukraine accepts donations from other nations that it then puts to developing weapons domestically. Several nations are already part of the scheme, which has been running since April 2024. Now the US has become a major contributor. Meza says the website it examined collects all the relevant information about donations by Ukraine's Western partners. It's on that list that the organization found a US donation, a huge donation. According to the MFI site, the US has pledged a staggering $764 million to Ukraine. Interestingly, this donation was made back in March, when tensions appeared to be at their highest between the US and Ukraine. Remember that March was the month when the US temporarily halted intelligence sharing and military aid to Ukraine. However, it was also the month when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump hashed out the terms of a 30-day ceasefire. Putin never agreed to that ceasefire. He is delayed constantly, overplaying his hand because he believed he could manipulate the US into doing what he wanted during the rollercoaster month. Putin was wrong. Russia's president failed. This donation is proof. Now over $750 million is being distributed among Ukraine's weapons manufacturers for them to spend on developing new weapons they can use to hit Putin where it really hurts, his own territory. That's the other remarkable thing to come out of Meza's report, as Pravda highlighted in its follow-up article. Ukraine has used all of the money the US donated back in March to fund the development of new long-range weapons it can use to strike against Russia. Those weapons terrify Putin. They bring what should have been a 5-day invasion that conquered Ukraine right back to Russia, allowing Ukraine to strike his country's cities and critical infrastructure. Of course, that leads us to an obvious question. What weapons has Ukraine funded with this US donation? Ukraine is keeping tight-lipped about the whole situation. Beyond listing the US as a donor to MFI, it said very little about how it's using the cash. There was no press release from either side back in March, likely because Trump was trying to keep his cards close to his chest during a tense month. However, 2 long-range weapons have emerged during the last few weeks that may give us a hint about where Ukraine has used the substantial US investment. Those weapons are the Long Neptune missile and a new drone that's making waves, pardon the pun, in the Black Sea. Starting with the Long Neptune, that missile has been in development for several months. It's a variation of the standard Neptune missiles Ukraine has used to wreak havoc against Russian ships in the Black Sea, with several key tweaks. Key among them, and as the name implies, is that Long Neptune is capable of traveling much larger distances than the original Neptune. Distances so large that Ukraine can use the missile to attack Russia on its own territory. The timeline for the deployment of Long Neptune appears to match the US donation to MFI. Though Ukraine has been working on the missile since late 2024, it wasn't until March 20th that news first broke that it felt confident enough to carry out its first test of its new missile. That test involved firing Long Neptune missiles, which are capable of traveling up to 621 miles, at an oil refinery in Tuapse. The strike was a massive success. It caused a devastating fire that destroyed at least 1 tank of Russian oil and took over 3 days for Russia's emergency services to put it out. As Krasnodar governor Veniamin Kondrativ put it at the time, after the attack of the Kyiv region on the night of March 13th, a tank containing about 20,000 tons of gasoline caught fire at the oil depot. On the surface, the fire covered more than 1,000 squares. The fire was assigned to the 4th degree of danger. So what do we know about this long-range Ukrainian missile? As we mentioned earlier, it's a variation of the R-360 Neptune that Ukraine unveiled just a few short months before Putin launched his February 2022 invasion. That initial missile was designed as a shorter-ship cruise missile capable of traveling around 174 miles while carrying a 330-pound warhead. It's based on the Soviet-era Kh-35 anti-ship missile, only it's better in every department. The original Neptune travels further than the Kh-35, it has better targeting and incorporates more complex electronics, and Ukraine has used it to devastate Russian ships in the Black Sea. Long Neptune takes everything the original Neptune offers when it comes to precision and technical know-how and expands upon it. We've already talked about the longer range. However, the missile's also been tweaked into a surface-to-surface weapon, enabling strikes such as the one seen in Tuapse a couple of months ago. As a cruise missile, Long Neptune benefits from being easy to manufacture, meaning Ukraine can achieve a high speed of production. Granted, it's not as fast as a ballistic missile, but it doesn't need to be. When accompanied by swarms of drones that Ukraine is building in the millions, Long Neptune is more capable of hitting most of Ukraine's targets deep inside Russia. Ukraine's problem for several years was figuring out how to make Long Neptune functional enough to be effective. On March 14th, it proved that it had solved the problem. It just so happens that the test happened in the same month that the US delivered its $764 million donation to the MFI. Are the two events linked? We can't say for sure. However, it seems likely that the US funds gave Ukraine's weapons manufacturers the final push they needed to either complete Long Neptune's design or get to the point where they could build enough of their new long-range missiles to make a test viable. And it's not just Long Neptune that the US donation to the MFI may have funded. Ukraine also has a new long-range drone that may well be a product of the $764 million it received from the US back in March. On May 6th, Ukraine unveiled a new drone that offers a massive improvement over any that it's produced domestically in the past. The highlight, as with the Long Neptune, is the sheer distance this new drone can cover. Ukraine says the unmanned aerial vehicle, which it has named FP1, is capable of traveling up to 994 miles while carrying a warhead weighing 264 pounds. That's a lot of firepower to pack into a drone that's capable of reaching Moscow, and Putin knows it. The most interesting thing about this drone is that it was produced very quickly. That's according to Anna Hvozdyar, who is Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Strategic Industries. This product was born in Ukraine and was scaled up quickly, she said during the FP1's unveiling. This is another thing we can share with our partners. Partners. Could Hvozdyar be referring to the US here? She may be telling the US that Ukraine put its $764 million investment into the MFI to such good use that it came up with a new long-range drone in a matter of months. Not only that, but it's a drone that Ukraine will be willing to share with all of the Western partners who've supported it in its war against Putin's rampaging Russian forces. It certainly seems possible, especially as Hvozdyar's announcement came amidst news that Zelensky is considering lifting a ban on Ukraine exporting its domestically produced weapons to other countries. Perhaps we're seeing a "you scratch our back and we'll scratch yours" situation in play. The US donated hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine's defense industry. That money led to the development of a weapon that is useful to both Ukraine and the US. Now the US potentially stands to reap the benefits of having access to a low-cost, long-range drone that packs a very heavy punch. Again, this is all speculation. The US donation was as secretive as could be, especially given the lack of a press release. Still, we can't deny that the timelines for both the Long Neptune's first real test and the unveiling of the FP1 seem to match up to the donation. Putin is panicking. For so long, he believed that he had the US on his side since Trump became president. That's why he was so confident about refusing the ceasefire offer Zelensky and Trump negotiated in mid-March. He had time, Russia's leader thought. He could string Trump along for as long as he wanted, asking for more and more as he continued his attacks against Ukraine. What Putin didn't know is that the US was supporting Ukraine heavily behind the scenes, even as Trump was making comments suggesting he was more sympathetic to Putin than he was to Zelensky. Russia's president got played, and it's only getting worse for him from here. The news of the massive US donation to the MFI broke just days after Trump delivered another big blow to Putin's belief that he could manipulate the United States. On May 1st, the Trump administration approved the first sale of military equipment to Ukraine since Trump took office. It's not a huge sale. Ukraine is going to spend $50 million on defense hardware and services. However, this sale, along with the donation, highlights just how deeply the US and Ukrainian defense industries are intertwined. Ukraine is no longer a country that's merely relying on the US to donate weapons to its defense against Russia's marauding forces. Ukraine and the US are partners. They're investing heavily into one another in historic deals that will lead to Ukraine growing more powerful at a time when Putin is starting to struggle with equipment deficits of his own. Oh, and there's also an official minerals deal between Ukraine and the US in the works. But we'll get to that in a moment. For now, Putin is raging because he's just discovered that the US is actively contributing to the MFI. That initiative strengthens Ukraine. It can now not only defend against Putin's many attacks, but actively hit Russia on its own territory thanks to the development of domestic long-range weapons. The most worrying thing about all of this for Putin is that the US contribution to MFI is among the largest Ukraine has received to date. As we mentioned earlier, several of Ukraine's Western partners are involved in the MFI scheme. Those 9 countries include Denmark, the Netherlands, Lithuania, Canada, Sweden, Iceland, Norway, the UK, and of course, the US. Collectively, those 9 countries have invested $1.5 billion into the MFI in 2024, $500 million of which had already been used via the Danish model of contracting. Under that model, employers and employees form collective agreements to work together, ensuring good pay and stellar working conditions that ultimately result in superior production. We've seen the impact that the model has made in the development of FP1 and Long Neptune. Even as it's ravaged by war, Ukraine is using the Danish model to showcase a strong commitment to the brilliant minds who are developing the weapons it needs to fight against Russia. But the real headline here is that the MFI led to $1.5 billion being pumped into Ukraine's defense industry in 2024. The US donation in March is more than half of the total Ukraine received through MFI last year. Remember that there's still more than half of 2025 to go. If the US keeps up this level of investment in Ukraine's defense industry, the $1.5 billion donated last year will seem like peanuts, especially as Ukraine's other partners pump money into MFI. Again, all of this will terrify Putin. After over 3 years of war, he thought Ukraine would be so weakened that it would no longer be capable of defending itself. The reality he now has to face is that Ukraine keeps getting stronger. And that brings us to the big question. What does the US donation of over $760 million to Ukraine's MFI program mean for the Ukraine war? The first answer is that Russia can expect a lot more long-range attacks on its territory in 2025 than it experienced in 2024. We can assume that much based on the fact that the US donation is apparently being dedicated to the development and manufacture of long-range weapons. These types of attacks are becoming commonplace in the Ukraine war. It was only a couple of days ago that Ukraine unleashed a horde of at least 524 drones that succeeded in shutting down 4 major airports in Moscow, along with striking several key Russian weapons production facilities. Putin has to face up to the fact that the war he brought to Ukraine has come home to roost. And it's not going anywhere. As the Atlantic Council noted in an article published in December 2024, Ukraine is leaning increasingly on long-range strikes against Russia. Long Neptune and the FP1 are just 2 of the weapons it's building for that purpose. By the end of 2024, it also unveiled the Peklo, which translates to hell in Ukrainian, that's capable of traveling up to 434 miles at speeds approaching 434 miles per hour. Zelensky also announced plans for Ukraine to build over 30,000 long-range attack drones by the end of 2025, all of which will have the purpose of hitting Russia on its own territory. According to the Atlantic Council, Ukraine's focus on developing domestic long-range weapons is partially a frustrated response to the restrictions placed on it by Western allies who've provided missiles to the country. That may be the case, however, Ukraine is also building these weapons out of necessity. Every successful strike in Russia represents a shot at Putin's credibility. Each serves as proof to the Russian people that the supposed special military operation isn't restricted to Ukraine. It's a war that's impacting their lives every day. That impact will only grow larger now that the US has dedicated $750 million to help Ukraine build more long-range weapons. And therein lies another problem this donation creates for Putin. It's helping Ukraine's weapons industry grow stronger. When Putin launched his full-scale invasion in February 2022, he believed his troops were taking on a weakened country that would put up little resistance. Ukraine proved him wrong. However, Putin had good reasons to believe in his plan, not least because Ukraine's domestic weapons production industry had long been neglected. Though Putin's initial plans didn't come to fruition, the fact that Ukraine relied so heavily on military aid from other countries during the first few years of the war only reinforced his belief in the country's weakness. Eventually, that aid would dry up. Russia would score an attritional victory. Putin didn't account for Ukraine being smart enough to set up programs like the MFI to strengthen its domestic defense industry. But it has, and Ukraine is getting a lot stronger. Between 2022 and 2023, Ukraine's defense industry achieved 69% growth, creating arms revenues of $2.2 billion. By 2024, that same industry had hit $9 billion in revenue. It's only going to keep on growing. That's a major problem for Putin because a thriving Ukrainian defense sector means more weapons being produced that prevent him from achieving his goals. When those weapons are being produced, in part because countries like the US are investing so heavily in Ukraine, that's just another shot to the expansionist ambitions Russia's president holds. That brings us to the final impact the US donating over $760 million to Ukraine's MFI has. It shows Putin that the US stands firmly in Ukraine's corner. We've touched on this point several times already, both in reference to the US-provided MFI donation and the $50 million in sales the US has approved to Ukraine. However, the biggest sign that Putin has lost any chance he had of influencing the White House comes from the minerals deal we mentioned earlier. On May 8th, Ukraine's parliament gave the green light to a minerals deal with the US, with a vote of 338 to 62. That deal is far more beneficial to Ukraine than Putin ever believed it could be. Initially, the US created a draft of the minerals deal that essentially gave it full control over the valuable resources on Ukraine's land. Trump also wanted the deal to include repayment of around $500 billion to the US, which he claimed was what his country had delivered to Ukraine since Putin launched his invasion. It was good for Putin. It showed that the US was strong-arming Ukraine. However, the final deal demonstrates a massive turnaround by the Trump administration. As we see through the MFI and the weapons sales, the US is now treating Ukraine like a partner. The new deal will lead to creation of a reconstruction investment fund, the very wording of which demonstrates that the US is looking toward a future where Ukraine isn't under Russian control. control. Ukraine gets to keep 50% of the revenue it generates from its vast mineral resources, while gaining investment from the US and other Western partners to fully exploit those resources. The $500 billion repayment has been dropped, plus the US has left the door open for future military aid donations and is essentially providing Ukraine with a security guarantee as it prepares to send US workers into the region that Putin wants to control. Combine that minerals deal with the massive US donation to MFI, and Putin can only reach one conclusion: he lost the battle to win Donald Trump's support. Now Russia has to deal with a resurgent Ukraine that has the full financial backing from the US. But what do you think about the US pouring over $760 million into the MFI? How important is that donation, both in terms of strengthening Ukraine's defense industry and reinforcing its partnership with the US? How do you think Putin will react to all of these signs that the US and Ukraine are strengthening their partnership? Let us know your opinions in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the latest developments in the Ukraine war.